Welcome to the Josh Huisman Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Josh Huisman Podcast. It is good to be here with you, and I am super excited because I have a guest here with me today who is near and dear to my heart. He is someone who I've been very close with over the past several years, and we're going to talk a lot more about our relationship. I have Dr. Charles McGowan here with me today. He is the founder of McGowan Global Institute. And I'll tell you what, you're also a man who's been in pastoral leadership for coming up on 50 years. I have a whole list of things in your bio here that I could go down with Columbia Theological Seminary, the U.S. Army, Naval Intelligence as a special agent in counterintelligence. I think I'm getting that correct. You have served as a moderator of the General Assembly in the Presbyterian Church of America. How does that measure up to being Apostolic Council for me at New Hope Community Church?
Well, one of the greatest honors of my life is to be your friend and to have a relationship with a New Hope Community Church. It's that's an interesting story. I enjoy telling my Presbyterian friends that I have an Apostolic Council role in a nearby church, and but quite seriously, it's a role that I take seriously. Mm-hmm. I enjoy my relationship with you. We meet monthly, and we talk about a variety of things in deepest of confidence. And I, from time to time, have an upfront relationship with the congregation. They know I exist, and I worship here from time to time, and meet with the elders whenever they feel like I need to show up, and helping them manage crisis and various issues and problems in the life of the church. It's a relationship that I enjoy, and a key part of that is your relationship and my relationship together. The way we meet together, it's a great blessing, really, to me.
Yeah, the church that I pastor here, New Hope Community Church, we're a non-denominational church, so we don't have an affiliation with anyone per se, and you know, I get this a lot when people will come in and they want to place membership at New Hope. They'll ask questions like, well, what's your oversight? What's the church governance? How does this look? And who holds you all accountable? Who's giving you advice? Who's wisdom? All of those things. And you have been someone, as our Apostolic Council, you said we meet once a month. We try and grab lunch. We talk about things. If there's something going on, hard-pressing decisions or things where we really need some guidance. You have been someone with your ministry experience who God uses to really help me as a pastor and to help our elder board. And I've had more than one occasion when we have had to go to the congregation and say, hey, we're walking through something kind of tough. And Dr. McGowan has been made aware of this, and he's walking with us and giving us some counsel in this. And that has saved me on a couple of occasions because they go, hey, that young guy, he might not know what he's doing, but we can count on Dr. McGowan with his experience. So right. I appreciate you in how you've done that. Did you ever think that this was something you would do?
No, it's come as a great surprise, quite frankly, but the more I think about it, I think that particularly non-denominational churches need to have some kind of accountability relationship. And I think it's very wise for New Hope to have written into their bylaws the requirement that there will always be an older, senior, experienced evangelical pastor that they're in relationship with that has meaningful input into the life of the church. But also, Josh, it has really been a blessing to me because it's one of the avenues that God has given me to leverage for the benefit of the kingdom all that God has taught me over the years,
right.
Through the school of hard knocks and mistakes, et cetera. And so that's one of the great blessings of the post-pastor years of my life. Mm-hmm. And I'm able to build into and to pour into the lives of younger pastors and congregations that are struggling.
Right. one of the things you said to me, so I became a senior pastor back in 2014. And you and I went out. We tried to grab lunch at Jason's Deli here in town. That's our usual place. And we were sitting in one of the booths. And you said to me when I was moving into this role, you said, Josh, the struggle you're going to find is that you don't even know what you don't know. and I at first when you said that, I'll be honest and tell you, like I wasn't too thrilled with you. I kind of thought I knew quite a bit of things at that point, and then over time, now I realize with each passing year how little I know about senior leadership. And where did that come from? But was that something you shared with people before, or because it's proven true? And I actually have been more thankful for it because it could scare someone off. But the truth is, you said about the lessons through hard knocks. You know, the only way to learn those lessons is to go through them.
Yeah. You know, I think if God enabled us to see everything that we were going to have to face at the front end, we'd be scared to death.
Yeah.
And we would probably just it would paralyze us in so many ways. And there's some things that you can't learn in advance. You learn as all of a sudden they're there. And somebody has to do something about it, and it happens to be your responsibility.
Right.
So, so it's impossible in many respects, in preparation to be a pastor, senior pastor, it's impossible to learn anything more than the broad general principles. The details, the crisis will be the means whereby you learn through struggle.
Right.
And there's no way that you can understand that fully. You can say, well, I know there's some things I don't know, but it obviously isn't got time yet for me to learn those. But in due time, and for you can say, and I'm thankful I've got an old seasoned guy who can walk with me through that.
Oh, 100%. And you know, it's funny. I remember very clearly it was in my first year of senior leadership. You know, I had been a youth pastor on staff at a couple churches. And I do remember very distinctly thinking there's really no difference between being on the staff of a church and being the senior pastor of a church. I really viewed them as being one and the same. And that changed in my first year when I remember facing a really difficult issue that was going on and sitting at my desk and thinking, well, somebody needs to say something about this.
And then you discovered that the buck stopped with you, right?
and then I just crawled under the desk and began to pray, you know, and that's when I realized, oh my goodness, I think this is more than I signed up for, you know, and that's right. That is where you come into play as someone who I could call upon, who I could kind of put this out there and even be talked off a ledge every once in a while if need be, or be encouraged or any of those things. And it's been vital to have you. And, you know, I have others who I talk to who don't have that same relationship with someone who they can reach out to. And every time I have an opportunity, I try to encourage them, say, you need to find someone, someone you trust, an elder that you can reach out to in confidence and really have these conversations, because why carry that weight if you don't have to, you know? You don't want to do it alone. So anyway, thank you for you. Thank you for being my friend.
Well, it's been a tremendous blessing for me, and I think this church's leadership years ago was very wise when they revised the bylaws to include that into the I think the elders told me that if we were a denominational church, we'd probably have a superintendent or a bishop or somebody who would be giving us advice and counsel, to whom we would, in a sense, be accountable, and to whom we could look for advice and counsel along the way. But we're out here by ourselves. And so I think it was wise for them to realize that that's a dangerous place to be.
Right. Well, if we could kind of go in a little different direction, because I said you have nearly 50 years of ministry experience, and I don't know how many stories you want to share with me in this episode here, but when we sit down and we have lunch and we talk through some things, there's every once in a while you share some stories with me that of things that happened during your time as a pastor in a church that honestly you look at me and go, that didn't really happen. Could that have really happened? You've been a pastor in a couple different states, and ultimately for many years you were the senior pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashville,
right?
And served faithfully. In fact, you're pastor emeritus there, I believe, is your official title there now. Before that, you were pastoring in Alabama.
I was senior pastor of the First Presbyterian Church, PCA, in Dothan, Alabama. That's down in the southeast corner of the state. And while I was still in seminary, I undertook a church planting project in suburban Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And then when I graduated, I became the church's first pastor. And so I've served in 3 states, and tell people I don't have a lot of experience. I've only pastored 3 churches, but all of them were long pastorates. The one I planted, I pastored for 13 years, and then in Dothan, I was there for 10 years, and then here in Nashville, I pastored for a little over 15 years. And so while I haven't moved a lot, I've had a deep longevity in 3 different places. Mm-hmm. And I think just sort of as a footnote, a pastor can't really begin to see fruit from his ministry long term unless he's there more than 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. These pastors that move every 2 or 3 years, they hardly build relationships. They've hardly got enough leverage established in order to really lead the church into some very new territory. Yeah. And then all of a sudden they're gone. And I think that's a big mistake. As a matter of fact, early on, I developed as a principle, I'm here for a lifetime until God clearly shows me he wants me somewhere else. Yeah. So every call I've ever accepted to be pastor, I assumed it was for the rest of my life. Yeah. And the rest of my ministry years, at least. And by the way, I was ordained 57 years ago.
57, okay.
Yeah. I think my math is right on that. I was ordained in 1966. And so you add 34 together with 23, and right, that's 57.
There
right?
You go. You've made, and I love that point that you make about longevity and staying in a position. Some good advice that I got when in 2013, which was the year before I became the senior pastor of New Hope, was I went and talked to a pastor and I said, any advice, anything you can say? And he said, never underestimate what you can accomplish in 5 years. You don't have to do it all in the first year.
Yeah, that's right.
And that made me realize, okay, so this is not just let's see how it goes in the first year. And this is a long-term commitment. This is a long-term plan. I've seen so much fruit. I'm 9 years into this now. I've seen so much fruit in the past 4 years. Those first 5 years was really just a period of really the Lord growing me, working with, not really even knowing who I was completely yet as a pastor. And these last 4 years being a time of God really moving and working in my life. And I would be starting over every time, or maybe to somebody who's listening out there right now, you're starting over every time and you're not able to get that real fruit that God can do in your life if you keep uprooting and uprooting.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel strongly about that. And my advice I give young pastors as they move into a new church is you would probably be unwise to take any major initiative that's new during the first year. Mm-hmm. Spend most of your year listening and building relationships and figuring out some of the church's history, the foundation that you're going to be building on, and make sure you build good, strong pastoral relationships. Be a good pastor. Mm-hmm. Build quality relationships with people through good, long conversations, et cetera, et cetera. And what you're doing is you are building leverage, leadership leverage for the future. Right. And you come in and start throwing out initiatives. You haven't built the kind of foundational, you haven't developed the kind of foundational capital that you need. Right. At that early. And so it's very, very important to pace yourself.
And I think that's good advice all the way down for church staff. Even if you're coming in as a children's pastor or youth or whatever, you're walking into a kind of a new space to instead of just putting in a whole bunch of new initiatives and plans and things and just saying, hey, here's my new thing and let's everybody jump on board.
Right.
Look at the life of the church, get to know the people, get to know all that, so that when you build those relationships, when you are ready to start implementing those things, you have allies as opposed to those who are more trying to protect something,
Yeah, people will honestly be saying to themselves, I'm not sure this is a good move for us, but I trust him. Mm-hmm. And I learned that he's an honest man, and if he figure out he's wrong, he'll back up. You're building trust, you're building respect, and that's very, very important for leadership.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about when you agreed to come on here with me is you recently walked through, a few years ago, your wife went to be with Jesus in heaven. And in the years leading up to that, you were caring for her. You were taking care of her. She had become ill, and you were her caregiver. Would you say that's?
Yes.
And you were one of several men in my life who was in that position of caring for their spouse, caring for their wife, and making sure they were okay. And that, for me, it was an interesting time, because in my mind it always been reversed. I guess I would always think, well, hey, us men, we're the ones who will probably go first. We're the ones, and our wives will be taking care of us and all that. But you really carried yourself in such an honorable way, at least from an outside perspective. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, your wife, Alice, and what are some things, just even in that time when you were caring for her, and then even in the years that have passed since she's gone to be with Jesus, that you could share?
Yeah, we discovered in about, probably as we were toward the end of our approaching our 50th wedding anniversary, I began to notice that she was not as mentally engaged. We would be in a social gathering, and she wasn't as talkative. She didn't seem to comprehend all that was being talked about, et cetera. And I talked to her doctor about that in a private setting, and she said, well, I've noticed that too, but I think maybe it's a hearing issue. And so we went to see an ear specialist, a hearing specialist, and actually got her outfitted for hearing aids. She did show some minor hearing loss, but it didn't seem to help. And furthermore, I noticed that she kept losing her hearing aids. She'd forget where she'd put them, and things of this sort. And we replaced a couple of sets, and they were pretty expensive. And so I finally decided I would talk louder. But in any case, I asked her doctor, who's a very close friend. She was a member of the church, and I said, would you open up the doors for us and refer us to Mayo Clinic in Rochester, which she did. And so we spent 10 days up there. Had a really a wonderful trip. We drove up in the middle of the winter. Crazy. That was crazy, a foolish thing to do. And she was diagnosed with a certain kind of dementia called mild cognitive impairment, which really affects the executive function of the brain, the ability to think logically, to connect the dots, so to speak, and also her short-term memory. And so I, at that time, was the executive director, the president of a local organization called Operation Andrew, which was an organization that the steering committee of the Billy Graham Crusade, which was held here in the year 2000, formed after the crusade was over. We reorganized ourselves to become a new organization called Operation Andrew, and our goal was to really do John 17. Father, I pray that they may be one as you and I are one, so that the world will believe that you sent me. And so we were concerned about church unity, because in the preparation for the crusade, we discovered that there was beneath the surface a lot of resentment toward the white church, particularly from the black church in Nashville. And so we decided, the steering committee decided that after the crusade was over, we needed to continue to meet and organize ourselves in order to really address the lack of unity in the body of Christ here in Nashville. Sure. And it was about that time that I was stepping down as pastor at Christ Presbyterian Church, and so I was asked to be the head of that, and which I did, and it was just a marvelous experience for me. But after about 6 or 7 years, Alice was diagnosed with dementia, and she had other issues too. She's diabetic, and she had high blood pressure and some heart issues and 2 or 3 others. She had several issues. But I told the board that I needed to step down and take care of her. And so I became her not just her primary caregiver, but her only caregiver. Mm-hmm. And she lived for 10 years. And I want to tell you, Josh, that those were precious 10 years. And people would see me. She eventually got to the point where she really couldn't walk, and that had to do with a spinal problem. And so she was, she would move. I would move around in a wheelchair, and people would come to me and say, "Oh, I admire the way you're caring for your wife," and I would say, "Listen, I'm no hero.
Yeah,
this is a great blessing for me. God has given me the privilege. She has been supporting me for 50 years as a pastor, and now I have the opportunity to convey to her that she's absolutely my first priority, and I'm going to. I find great delight in caring for her. So, please don't think I'm a hero or put me on a pedestal of any sort." And I say that often. Even today, I say that often. And because, to be honest, there was a period in our marriage where she felt certain she was certainly no more than 2 and probably 3rd priority in my life, because the church had become my mistress. And we can talk about that later if you want to. But she really felt abandoned by me. And we had small children, diapers, and all of that, 4 children. And for a good long season when I was planting a church, she was all alone. And thankfully, 2 godly elders who were about my age confronted me, and they said, "Your marriage is in trouble." And I said, "How'd you know that?" And they said, "Our wives pray with your wife."
Yeah, and I think that's such a powerful thing. I know my wife does a wonderful job in her role. Being my wife, she also works with middle school students here at the church. But what you just said is that's often a neglected aspect of church life. The senior pastor and his wife, and the wife, if we're not careful, can be relegated to what you said and moving down that priority list as we pursue whatever it is that we think is truly important. You said the church was your mistress. What do you mean by that?
Well, it means that I was more strongly committed to her and got more satisfaction out of spending time with her than I did with my own family, and that was driven by a deep sin in my heart, which God began to reveal to me and bring me into deep conviction about. It's a sin of pride, sin of ambition, an ungodly ambition, and I got real good at playing the preacher trump card. Sweetheart, we're serving God here, and I'm the pastor of this church, and I've just got to always be on call, and so there were periods in our marriage as the children were very small, when I would go 2 or 3 days and never see my children awake. I'd be up and gone before they got up, and home only after they were in bed, and sleep, and so. Needless to say, that meant she had to do it all. She had very little help from me, but I was confronted by 2 godly elders in the church I was planting, and they confronted me and they said, "Things have got to change," and so I quickly yielded to their direction and leadership, and repented of all of that. And we don't have time on this podcast for me to talk in great detail about it, but they really enabled me to change the priorities of my life.
Wow. Yeah.
The priorities ought to be God first, your wife and your children, your wife second, and your children as a subset of that, and then your work, and the ministry is our work, the work that God has called us to do. And it's unfair for pastors to use the preacher trump card in order to neglect them.
Yeah. One of the things, you're speaking to my time of life right now.
Yeah.
I've told our church before, and people who know me, I have my oldest son is a freshman in college. My middle son is a junior in high school. And my two daughters, I have an 8th grade daughter and then a 2nd grade daughter. I have a child in each phase of that time of growing up and where they are, So maybe what would you say to me, or maybe if you could go back and speak to yourself in that time, what would you say to a pastor who thinks, but I'm doing the Lord's work. This is what I'm called to do, and I'm going to put my family on the altar and pursue that. What would you say?
I would say take enough time to back away just for a season, a weekend or something of that sort, and ask yourself the question, how badly are my priorities confused? And because that can only happen if your relationship with God is not right. And one of the things I would do over again if I were beginning as a pastor, based on what I've learned, as I said, through the School of Hard Knocks,
right.
I would discipline myself to spend more time alone with God. And giving through the scriptures, through prayer, just through quiet solitude. I would quieten myself so God could show me my sin. And if I'd have done that, my sin of pride and arrogance and ambition, my need to feel wanted by the public, so to speak, my love for the podium, and my love for adulation by the congregation, God would have addressed quietly in that quiet time. God would have insisted. I wouldn't have had to have elders to confront me. So I would have spent more time alone with God, at least an hour a day, in His Word and in prayer, in solitude, in meditation and reflection, humbling myself before God. The greatest virtue for any Christian is humility. And the contrast is also true. The greatest sin is pride. Go back to the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, right.
And so, and pastors are very vulnerable to that because they're always up front. People are always telling them how wonderful they are. You're getting invitations to be here, to be on this committee, to speak at this and to do that, and it's feeding your ego, your sinful pride, and it's very easy for us to screw up our priorities.
Yeah.
So that's something that happened to me, and it happened to her gradually in such a settled way over a period of time. And had it not been for two godly elders who confronted me, I'm not sure what would have happened.
Yeah.
And but thankfully, God did two things. He sent two elders to not only confront me but held me accountable, and to do some things financially that enabled me to refocus my attention on my wife and my family, and then He moved me out of Atlanta to a city that did not have a major international airport where I could be traveling all over the country, speaking all over the country, et cetera, et cetera. I'd have to drive 3.5 hours to get to Atlanta to get to the airport in order to do that. And so God was good. But we began this part of the conversation, by talking about caring for my wife.
Yes.
And so all of this speaks to the joy that God gave me 10 full years. The last 10 years of our marriage, to give her absolute, humanly speaking, first priority in my life. You know, I was able to care for her. I gradually took over every aspect of her life, from cooking, washing clothes, keeping the house clean, to ultimately taking care of her personal hygiene. And I never found it to be a chore. I genuinely enjoyed caring for her. And the last word she spoke to me before she died was, "Sweetheart, I love you so much." And it brings tears to my eyes to even think about that today. Yeah. Because God, in his faithfulness and his goodness, enabled the time to be redeemed and for the healing to take place.
Yeah.
And
if I could, on occasion, you come and preach at New Hope. And in her final years, she would come and she would be here and she'd be sitting here and watching you preach. And she always just had this smile on her face the entire time, And so when she says to you that she loves you, and that was evident in even just how she was looking at you in that moment, Yeah,
and she was, and of course I'm biased when I say this, but she was in my mind the quintessential perfect pastor's wife. She was a great cheerleader for me behind the scenes. But she was also an accountability partner. She would say, I overheard you say to Bill that you were going to go visit his wife in the hospital. Have you done that yet? That kind of a thing. And so she would hold me accountable. And
that doesn't necessarily mean. Listen, I don't mean to cut you off, but I have a wife I'm blessed with, Sarah, who does a fantastic job with similar things like that.
Yes.
Even sometimes when I want to go, would you stop reminding me?
It would irritate me. I would confess it would irritate me. And but anyway, she was a great supporter, but she took great delight. People would tell me after she went to heaven. Alice was sitting, and Alice and I would sit together in church one Sunday, and you were saying something. I was so moved and touched, and I would whisper to Alice, "It must be wonderful to be married to a man like that." And she would say, "You ought to have to live with it," And so she had a great sense of humor. She was a great lady, and obviously I loved her deeply and miss her terribly every day. But God promises us in his word to heal our broken hearts.
Yeah.
Psalm 147, verse 3. And he has done that. That was all. She went to heaven almost 6 years ago.
Wow.
But God has kept me very, very busy, and I'm involved in the work of the ministry in a multiple number of ways. And I get up every morning with a full schedule, things to do, and that really helps with the loneliness.
Yeah. You have a great Alice story. You've told me this on several occasions. I don't know if you're willing to share it here on this podcast. That has to do with a check that showed up in the mail. If you're willing to share this story, you got to tell it.
Yeah, this is a wonderful story. There was a lady in a former church who really disliked me, and she had probably good reason to dislike me, but she really became a great opponent. Let's put it kindly. It was a great opponent to me, and she did everything she could to discourage me and to make things difficult for me in the life of the church. And she was quite wealthy, and she was using her wealth in order to try to get some things done in the life of the church. And I said, no, I'm not going to. I'm going to recommend that the elders not approve that or something of this sort. And so one day a letter came in the mail from her, not to me, but to my wife. And she said, "Dear Alice, I really admire you so much, and I feel sorry for you because you have to live with the man you're married to." And she said, I'm hopeful that this enclosed check would somehow bring comfort to your heart and encourage you, because I know you must be very discouraged living with this man. And
it really is just.
And so she chuckled when she read it and handed me the letter and the check. I think it was a check for, I believe it was $500, maybe $1,000. But I read the letter and I said, "You are going to send that check back to her, aren't you?" She said, "Are you crazy? We need a new washing machine."
Yeah, right. And you went, okay, yeah,
Okay.
that's a good point. Yeah. Oh, man. Well, and, before we move on to another thing I wanted to ask you about, if you're willing to, I love that story. If you're willing to talk about it, you did something really special. You said it's been 6 years since she was gone, but since she's been with the Lord, and in the time of, maybe could you speak a little bit to the grief, because when you're caring for someone in that time, and I've talked with others who have been caring for loved ones, and it's hard. I mean, for some it becomes very difficult because you want to make sure they're taken care of, and then they're gone.
Yeah.
How did you grieve in that aftermath? How did you get through that time?
There are several things that I learned. One is a dear lady in the church who's pretty well known because she's quite a well-known book writer, Sarah Young, who wrote Jesus Calling. Mm-hmm. Well, she still is a member at Christ Presbyterian Church, and during the visitation prior to the funeral service, she came through the line and greeted me, and she said, "Charles, I want to suggest something to you. I want to suggest that as you grieve, that you write." And she said, "I suggest that you develop a list of the people that you can remember who said, 'I'm going to be praying for you,' etc., and regularly correspond with them and give them an account of what's going on in your life so they can pray for you." Mm-hmm. And so I began to journal in the form of writing a letter periodically to a list of about 60 or 70 people that I recall as having said, "I'm going to really be praying for you during your grief period." And so I began to write letters, and before I knew it, those letters were being shared with multiple friends, So I suspect several hundred people read those letters, and over a period of a year, the first year, I would sit down and seek to be as honest and transparent as I could possibly be about what I was feeling, the loneliness, the anxiety, hard decisions that I was having to make, new things I was having to do that I'd never had to do before, and those kinds of things, and that was a very helpful thing. It helped me to give expression to and dig deep into my emotional makeup, and so that was one thing that was very, very helpful. It forced me to kind of probe my emotional makeup and not kind of put a veneer over it, cover it up, or repress it. And there's a group of guys I've been meeting with for about 35 years on Friday mornings, and those guys were on my list. And those guys suggested a couple of years later, they were talking about what those letters had meant to them, because I would share my heart. I would just pour out my heart in those letters, and then I would say, hopefully you have found in this letter things that would help you to pray for me. And by the way, I'd love to pray for you as well. Would you call me or write me a note or send me a text or something so I could pray for you? And so there was an exchange there. But these guys obviously were greatly blessed by those letters, and they published them, self-published, kind of a little spiral ring notebook thing, those letters. And so I've been able to share them with lots of people. I don't think I have any left. I may have a few left, but not many left. We didn't print all that many copies, but that was a very helpful thing. Just as a something that not as, I don't think, profound, but a niece who came to the memorial service from over in North Carolina, as she was leaving, she said, "Uncle Charles, I want to give you 2 pieces of advice." I said, "Okay, I'm open for any kind of advice." And she said, "Well, never come home to a dark house. Make good use of timers so that if you're away, when you come home and unlock the door and come in the house, there's light. Never come home to a dark house."
It's something you wouldn't think of.
Yeah.
But it's, okay.
And then she said, "Make good use of Pandora and Spotify, and place speakers around the house, and don't live in a silent house. Have music going all the time, not busy talk shows and things. Just good background music." You see, that'd be a good companion. And you know what? She's right. Those 2 things, very, very practical, easy things to do. But I developed those 2 habits, and it really helped. The worst part of the day is late in the afternoon. As the sun goes down, my spirit begins to wilt. Oh. And for that reason, I developed another habit, which is probably not a good habit. I go to bed early. And if I go to sleep, I don't have to deal with that, you know. The problem with it, I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's still dark, you know. So, but that was a new experience for me, and I was about probably 6 or 8 months into my grief, and I was at a conference up in Cincinnati, and I was talking to a man during a break time, and I said, "Tell me about your wife." He said, "Well, she died." I said, "How long ago?" And he says, "Well, about 5 years ago." And I said, "Well, I'm just at the front end of that journey, and I'm counting on God to heal my broken heart. How long has it taken you?" He said, "Well, I would honestly say it took 4 years for me to regain my stability and feel like I was healed." That was very discouraging, but he was right. You know, it took me about 4 years to regain my stability and to be able to live at peace with the fact that I was going to live the rest of my life alone, probably.
Yeah.
And I can say today, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about her offer and miss her a whole lot.
Yeah.
And but the wound has been healed. It's still tender, to the touch, so to speak. But the wound has been healed. The wound to my broken heart has been healed. Yeah. God has healed that, and I give Him all the glory for it.
And that I'm so thankful to hear you share this, because the reason why I want to ask that question is because there's so many. We walk through this life. Has loss and it has grief, and I think there are many out there who are like you, where you went to the one man and asked that question: How long? How long will I feel like this?
Right.
And there's some out there who maybe they don't have someone who they could go out to, and so for you to share that and just to say, you know, that timeline might be different for everybody, but at least it puts it out there to say, hey, listen, there's a healing that can come to your heart. You'll always miss them and love and care for them.
Yeah.
You know, and but you can kind of have that out there on the horizon, and you can see, you know, you're going to be okay. Would you say that?
Yeah. You know, the first night I was alone. The first night she was not in the bed. I went to bed. It had been a long day, and she died early that morning. And by the time 6 o'clock came, I was bushed, and the children insisted I go to bed. So I went to bed, but I couldn't go to sleep. And I tossed and tumbled, and I wept. And finally, about midnight, I got up, turned the light on by the bedside table, sat in a comfortable chair, and opened the scriptures. Mm-hmm. And I began to pray, God, take me to some place in the Word that will encourage me and comfort me. And He took me to Psalm 34:18. He is close to the brokenhearted, And then I saw a chain reference to that was to Psalm 147, verse 3, which was even more wonderful. God heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds.
Yeah.
And so I claimed that night, and I said, God, I'm going to depend on you to do that. And you haven't told me how long it's going to take you, but I'm counting on you to heal my broken heart. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't sleep at all that night. I spent it weeping and poring over the scriptures and praying all night long. And it was a tough night, but God is faithful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'm so thankful for you sharing that. And I really think it's helpful to a lot of people.
Yeah.
People who might be going through that right now.
Mm-hmm.
And just maybe those words can just be words of comfort in that moment, to kind of, to bring a little lightheartedness to this. One thing I said to you not that long ago, you have a very, this involves Alice as well. You have a very nice cadence in your speech, and you have a nice deep voice. When you speak, you almost go, I need to listen to this guy. He says very profound things. And I said to you, did Alice ever, think that? I got to listen to Charles because he speaks so profound.
Alice. I think Alice had real appreciation for the gifts that God had given me, and I don't think she ever yearned to be under the spiritual leadership of anyone other than me. Mm. But she knew that I struggled with pride, and she refused to feed it.
That's great.
and sometimes she would say, I think you preached too long. You lost him about 5 minutes before you ended, or 10 minutes before you ended. Or, why did you have to tell that story? And so she was lovingly critical. But boy, that was so valuable. So valuable.
Kept your feet on the ground?
Yeah, kept my feet on the ground. But she did it in such a way that you knew that she loved you and respected you. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, though, in moments of disgust, maybe she would say, when I married you, I didn't sign up for this. You never told me you were going to be a preacher. Here I am, Mm-hmm. And because in those days I was an Army officer. We were married and went right into the Army. And then when I got out of the Army, I went to work with the Office of Naval Intelligence. And then all of a sudden, one day I came home from the office and I said, sweetheart, I've been wrestling with God all day, and I believe God's calling me to the ministry. And she said, I'm not surprised by that. Mm. She said, I'm aware of the fact that you've been, and we'd never had talked about it. It's interesting. And she said, I think that it's obvious that God's been working in your heart. And she said, I think you'd be a wonderful pastor.
Wow, that's powerful.
But then she would say, in moments just to rib me, she would say, I never signed up for this. In other words, when I married you, that wasn't on the agenda,
Yeah. Man, well, as you say that, you're kind of talking about a calling into ministry that you had at that point. And I think that might be a good topic for us to kind of bring this to a close on, because sure. I go back to that question I asked you earlier. If you could go back in time, think about that before you were called into ministry. You're about to go and pursue this life that the Lord has put on your heart. If you could go back and talk to yourself before you jumped into ministry, would you say, hey, if you could do anything else, go do that? Yeah. Because you didn't know the struggles, or you didn't know what was ahead on that road. And I think that's one of the things I'd like to say I thought I was prepared for. I'd like to say I knew the struggles that might be ahead or the battles that I might face. Now, there are highs and there are wonderful blessings in those moments as well. But I think going into it, if I had known some of those challenges that I was going to face in ministry, I might have wanted to do something else. Have you ever looked at that? Or maybe what are some things you could speak to in that area? Like maybe the battles of ministry that you face?
Yeah, I would say that even the most diligent pastor, the most faithful pastor, the pastor who probably most consistently keeps his priorities straight, struggles with the demands that are always there. It's a 24/7 job, 24 hours, 7 days a week job. And you're always on call. And when everybody else has the weekend off is when you're the busiest, And holidays are not holidays for pastors, I mean, at least Easter and Christmas and,
Right. And definitely weekends.
Yeah, definitely weekends. And the fact of the matter is the pastors, I think it's true of most pastors, the pressure increases as the week goes on. And by the time Sunday morning comes, I mean, you're loaded down with, you've been preparing, you've been busy, you've been visiting people, you've been having committee meetings, you've had encouragements, you've had disappointments, you've had conflicts, and on and on and on, and counseling, and on and on and on. But Sunday's coming.
Yeah.
Sunday's coming. And so the kids want to go to do a picnic on Sunday afternoon or something. They say, well, you might go physically, but you're really not all there.
Yeah.
You're anticipating Sunday. At least I was, you see. And so try as you might, it's tough to be all there all the time with your family, and even during family time. And so pastors need to go into it realizing that being a pastor is generally underpaid for the time you give, at least, and for the education you have brought to the table. And it's very, very stressful. The demands are very, very high. I can't think of many professions that carries with it as much stress and demands and as high expectations as the work of the pastor. And just think about it. You're the shepherd of a flock. You're looked upon as a community, one of the community leaders, et cetera. And then there's the church community, and you're called upon from time to time to be a part of community-wide things and church-wide things. And then there's funerals that can't be scheduled, you know?
Yeah.
And then there are weddings, and there are all kinds of things. And there are a lot of balls to be juggled. And I remember years ago there used to be an act that you could often see on variety shows of guys spinning plates on flexible sticks. You remember that?
Yes.
And I often feel like the ministry is that kind of a thing. You've got these 8 or 10 or 15 plates, and your job is to keep them all spinning, you know? Yeah.
And each individual plate is very important to that specific person.
That's exactly right, or that particular aspect of the ministry. Yes. And so any plate that falls, all of a sudden you become the villain, you know?
And so I know one of my struggles, I would like to say a struggle I used to have, but it just continues to be, I don't know that I'll ever get over it, is that you genuinely do care about those plates. And you want to be there for everyone and everything at all times, and it just leads to a burnout.
Yeah. And
I think that speaks to what you're talking about with the challenges of that, and not being able then to be present for other things. It's rare, if I were just to be honest with you, that I don't have something on my mind when I'm at another location or whatever. There's something that's always
the next thing is always before you.
Yes.
The next thing, and so. Yeah, occasionally a young pastor will call me and say, "Do you have a few minutes?" I'll say yes, and they say, "Well, I've got a major problem," and they will unfold this very, very gigantic problem, and I will say, "Well, before I really respond to that, I want to thank you for reminding me of how blessed I am no longer to be the pastor of a local church." And then I share with them the best I can. Things I've learned over the years that might be helpful for him to think about as he wrestles with that. Might even suggest some possible approaches and things of this sort. But all of that, I'm not begging for sympathy. I'm just simply saying the work of a pastor is a hard job. It's a very hard job. And particularly in smaller churches, the pay is marginal, very marginal. And if the wife didn't work, probably the family couldn't survive in many cases. And
I think in many cases when you're saying, I'm not vying for sympathy or anything like that,
Right.
The truth of the matter is if I could go back and talk to myself, I would say, you're going to love it. Mm-hmm. You're going to be so thankful for it. And I think you would feel the same way. I mean, the even now, just sitting and talking to you and the relationships and the experience and the things that you've gone through, you've seen how the Lord is faithful through all of it.
Oh yeah, I think it's the highest calling you can. It's a very high calling. Let's put it that way. It's a very high calling. I often say to pastors, don't ever take lightly the fact that you're the one who is called in the crisis moment. Mm-hmm. That is an honor. The family has just gotten word that the little baby has a terminal cancer. And you're called.
Yeah.
Or the accident has just happened and the father has been killed, Or the wife has just discovered that the husband is having an affair and you're called. Mm-hmm. I said, at the happiest moments and in the darkest moments, Christians want to talk to their pastor.
Yeah,
and they probably won't remember the sermon that you worked so hard on, but they'll remember that you were there in that darkest moment, and that you were there to celebrate the birth of the baby as well,
Yeah,
and to dedicate the baby, or in the Presbyterian's case, baptize the baby, and I said, that's a high honor. It's a very high honor. You be a good steward of that. Mm-hmm. And remember that they don't call you preacher, they call you pastor.
Yeah. No, I love that so much. And I know for me, always keeping that in the forefront of my mind, even in the responsibility of being a pastor overall and how I interact with people and my family and my relationship with the Lord. You go back to spending your time with the Lord, to be grounded in that, to understand. I think what you're talking about to me is responsibility, of the calling that God has placed on us, and being mindful of that. And my mind went to an experience I had. This goes back several years, where it's very easy for me. I'm not that big of a deal. I really am not. Hey, I'm just a normal guy, but I remember walking into a funeral one time of a woman in the church whose father had passed away. And I was going to be there and to sit with her. And when I got there, you could just tell she had more comfort. She felt at peace. In her words, I'm so thankful. I'm glad you're finally here. And she sat by me for the majority of that service, and I went, oh my goodness, and I'm very aware that's not me. That's just the Lord puts us in these positions. But it showed me what you just said. That was one of my first experiences with that your presence matters.
There was a dear lady in the first church I pastored, the church I planted in suburban Atlanta, who often said to me, Charles, I don't remember any sermons you preached, but when I called you when Albert was dying. And at 2:00 in the morning, you came to the hospital and spent the rest of the night there in the hospital with me. She said, I'll never forget that. And you'll never know how God used that to bring comfort to my heart. And she says, there's no way I could ever thank you for caring like that. And standing over his bedside and put your hand on his head and anointed him and praying for him in the last few minutes of his life. And she said that, and now it was important for me to do that. But you know what? I got up in the middle of the night and left my family.
Yeah.
In other words, it's costly. But love is always costly. Mm-hmm. If you don't love, you don't sacrifice. And but we've got to find ways to regularly remind our family that other than my relationship with God, my relationship with you is the most important thing in their life.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm your father, I'm your husband, and you really matter. And I'm going to be there for your softball game, for your baseball game.
Yeah.
I'm going to be there when you get in trouble. I'm going to be there. And but let me just tell you, pastors are pulled all the time, and it's not easy.
Yeah. But you're going to make it through.
You're going to make it through.
You're going to make it through.
It's a high calling.
Well, listen, I think that's a great note to end on. I want to thank you for 57 years of ordained ministry in the church. I mean, what a wonderful thing. I don't know if you know this, but that's longer than I've been alive. Do you know that?
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So anyway, so thank you so much. I cherish your friendship, and I cherish your counsel and the time that you spend with me, and it's such a helpful thing to me. And I know even what you've shared today is going to be very helpful to a lot of people. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, I've been honored to have been invited to be on your podcast. I'm pleased that you're doing a podcast, and I would quickly say that you obviously have gifts in the area of interviewing people, and so I commend you and want to encourage you to continue the good work, because you're multiplying your ministry. Here we are sitting in your church facility, but there are probably people listening to this podcast who will never set foot in this church facility. Mm-hmm. Of course, if you live near the church, come on by.
Come on by.
God bless you, brother. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Josh Huisman podcast. New episodes dropping every Monday. So go ahead and subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube as well. So have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.